right, now next up is Mike, who's jumping in for McKenna. I'm super bad with names, but basically we get the same talk about testing GraphQL as was planned, which I think is super, super cool. Mike has volunteered himself to jump in tonight. Hi, Mike. How's it going?
Good. Hello. I'm super happy to jump in and actually meet your community for the first time. The circumstances maybe aren't ideal, but the second time I could maybe come to Zurich and listen to a talk and have a nice local beverage with everybody there.
That would be lovely. Where are you based, actually?
In Finland.
Oh, okay. So at least like same times. I think it's same time zone. Is it same time zone or is it like 1 hour off?
One ahead, and the backstory is that my colleague who was going to give the presentation lived in Zurich and was in this community, so I'm helping her out with that. But it gives me I've never been to Zurich before actually, so it gives me an incentive to go and meet.
Definitely. If you're ever making it over to Zurich and things are safe again, let us know and we're happy to host you. That would be fantastic.
That'd be great.
But I think now, without further ado, people are probably like super jiggly for your talk. So let's get going with that. Just quick question at the chat. Anyone in the chat using GraphQL? I know that we're using GraphQL for the Web Zurich website, for instance. Anyone else? Any GraphQL users here? Like, give us a show of hands, kind of. That'd be fun. Also, again, I see that we have 18 people in the stream. I'm pretty sure not everyone has said hi in the chat, so feel free to say hi in the chat. And once we get the slides up and running, we will commence the second talk of today.
Yeah, let me turn the video off because I'm going to be streaming from my computer. Is it okay if I do a share screen right now?
Sure. Yeah. Please go ahead.
Okay, great. Let me just make sure that I have the GraphQL Playground up. It's always this demo effect thing. So
I've been there, Mike. I've been there so many times. I've done talks at Web Zurich myself, and I had this like situation like it worked 5 minutes ago. I swear to God, it used to work just 5 minutes ago. So that's something that people are used to, thanks to me.
Good. You prepared the terrain well for me, but hopefully this is sharing. It looks like it is.
This
is my Ubuntu box back at home. So I'd like to show you what I'm going to present to you today. I'm sure that it's not as elegant as the front end you talked about, but this is the demo project that my company maintains called the Mishkin Bank. And it uses GraphQL and Open API. But today I'm just going to talk about the GraphQL and how to test it. So I'm going to look at 2 ways to test GraphQL. And for those of you who are not using it, it'll hopefully be a nice little intro as well. But maybe my the overarching thing I'd like you to remember from this talk at the end, we'll see it kind of time and time again, is as technology gets slick and wants you to forget more and more things, it's harder and harder to remember how to test. So it used to be that like GraphQL, you would use Express. Now you no longer use Express. Now you can use it in Next.js, and all of these things make it easier and easier to use. But the testing situation hasn't really evolved that well with it. So it makes it harder and harder to test. And then as a result, people don't write tests. It doesn't need to be that way. So what I'm going to do is give you tips on how to do that. And then all this is open source, so you can check that as well. So the Mishkin Bank is, you could sign on as a root, sign on as a user, transfer money, all the sorts of stuff you can do with the bank. And authenticate as a root. If you want to be the owner of the bank, then you put in the password. So that's the first thing we're going to do. We're just going to try out the bank, and I'm going to show you kind of the first way to test GraphQL. So remember, I said this is split up in 2 parts. One kind of the first part, I didn't say this yet, is interactive, and the second part is programmatic. So now I'd like to start the first part. So if you're following along at home, you can just check out github.com/mishkin/bank, which I have open right here. So I'll go back to that same README that you have, and what I would like to do is npm run dev, and this is kind of where the demo effect would normally explode, but it hasn't yet. So it's running the way that it ran 5 minutes ago before I did this. So good sign there. So now what I'm going to do is go to the endpoint. I'm going to go to this endpoint actually, so you can see the Mishkin Bank. So this is our UI. No hidden fees, save money, view your spending, invest your earnings. By the way, I'm the founder and CEO of this company called Mishkin. We do testing, but we've said that if that ever goes south during this weird economic time, then we could always just use the Mishkin Bank in production. But for now, it's our demo app. So this is what it looks like. If you're building a web app, maybe certain things look familiar, like whatever. So it's built using Next.js. And the way that Next.js works, at least in the most recent iterations, is you can have an API under a folder called API. So that's where GraphQL API is. So the way Next.js mirrors the file hierarchy. So if something is an API GraphQL, then it will be /API/GraphQL in Next.js. So to show you that I'm not lying to you, let's do /API/GraphQL. And here you have something called GraphQL Playground. So this is the first bit about how to test GraphQL. In here, there's a schema that shows my whole entire Mishkin Bank schema. And in here, this is like full-blown documentation for the Mishkin Bank. So you'd think that I'm like a very responsible coder with all this beautiful stuff in here. But actually, I'm a very lazy coder, and all of this stuff happens out of the box. So the first thing I would like to show you is just how to like leverage your laziness to your advantage by just putting in the 1 or 2 lines of code that you need to make it look like this, and then I'll show you how that relates to testing. So when you're building using Apollo, in this case it's using Apollo, a schema is the thing that drives your server. So this has all the business logic. That's kind of the boring part. I'm not going to get into how the Mishkin Bank works yet. We'll get into that when we talk about writing the test. But the important part is not the business logic. It's these 2 little things. Introspection is true and Playground is true. If you just add these 2 settings, like literally just these 2 settings, then you get this Playground for free in a browser. And this allows you to test out your GraphQL API. So let me show you how that works. So here, it has autocomplete. I'm going to sound like I'm a salesman for GraphQL Playground, but it's not the case. I didn't build this thing. It's just I use stuff like this all the time. So it shows all the queries. So for example, I could send query root, and it will say I'm not signed in as root. I could also look at the documentation and see that there's a query root that should return a Boolean. There's a mutation authenticate as root. So let's do that. I'm testing out to see if my GraphQL works. So authenticate as root. Authenticate as root. If I click on it, we see it takes an argument password. Let's look at the README. So the README says the password is password with $signs and a 0. But let's assume that I am testing it and I put in just a regular old O and I press play. Then it throws an error saying incorrect password. So I've just kind of done my first test. I'm testing around and it has the wrong password, and Apollo says incorrect. So I could go back to the documentation, see what's going on, and I realize me, the tester, I was wrong. This is my super secure password to control all of the money in my bank. And I click on it, and then it says now I'm authenticated as root. And then if you go back to the schema, you could think of it like you're poking around or the documentation. Okay, so authenticate as root. So let's check out all the clients, for example. So now we can look at clients in the bank, and I can get the name and the email of each client. And when I run it, it says you can only fetch users as root. So that means that the authentication here is broken, because you remember I authenticated as root. So here in my test, and this is a test, this is something that's purposefully broken in the Mishkin Bank. So backing up, again, I said that we're a testing company. So we actually keep our demo repo in a broken state, specifically to show how our testing tool finds these errors. That might sound a little weird, but when you're a testing company, that's how you roll. So we're logged in as root, but we can't find clients. So that's a bug. But here, if I'm doing exploratory testing with my GraphQL Playground, then I would see that as a bug, and then I'd go back into the code and fix it. So we haven't gone into automated testing yet. We've just gone into exploratory testing. But for those of you that build web APIs, you're usually consuming APIs. You're not producing them. But let's say that you're building a web app, and the web app uses a GraphQL API. And for an example of what that could look like, you could see that. Let's see in here, so these pages, for example, clients index. So here the client is sending a query. So this query right here that I'm sending from my client, I can copy and paste it into this, and it should work exactly the same. So it says unauthenticated as client, but it didn't complain about a parsing error. Whereas if I had done this and deleted a curly bracket, it would not even be able to parse it. It's actually freezing up and getting mad at me. It doesn't even run the query. This allows us to like take the queries right from our web app, copy and paste them into the browser, and test them out. It's a pretty manual type of testing. I personally, as a developer, hate doing this sort of exploratory manual testing because it feels like kind of grunt work. But it's super useful to make sure that like when you're writing an app for the first time, that it behaves as expected. And as you saw, getting one of these up and running is as easy as adding two environment variables in or two Boolean flags in an Apollo project. So that's the first bit that I wanted to talk about testing, and that's the minor bit. The major bit, which fits quite well with what Guillaume was talking about in terms of like mocking data. Here we're not really mocking, but you could definitely hook up something like Makun to drive something like this. But it has to do with automated testing of GraphQL APIs, and that's maybe the more interesting bit. So whether you're consuming or producing GraphQL APIs, at a certain point, you'll want to work with them in your tests in a CI/CD pipeline. And there, you're not going to pay some poor individual to interact with a web UI in your CI/CD pipeline. That would be cruel if like there was somebody that did that on every commit and then added a check mark to your Git branch. So like you want it to be automatic, and you would like software to do it, of course. So that's the next thing I'm going to talk about is how to make GraphQL testing automatic. So some of these concepts are going to be foreign if you're not from the JavaScript world. If you are, they might be a little bit more familiar. But what I'll try to do is talk about the general principle and the specific in JavaScript. And then if you have any questions about how to do this in Phoenix, I myself work mostly in PureScript and Haskell. So if you want to know how to do this in Haskell or PureScript, like let me know. But for now, I'm going to be doing it in JavaScript. So I'm going to use a framework called Jest. So getting out of here, in order to install Jest, npm install save dev Jest. Great. We are going to install Jest. It's already installed, but this is going to be our test runner. And I'm just going to run two tests. So I've written them already, but we're going to do a little live coding as well. I have a test that says addition worked, where I expect 1 to 1 to be 2. And then GraphQL worked. So, but who likes passing test, right? Let's make it fail first. So npm test. So we're going to run that test, and this one I didn't change will pass, but the one on top will fail. Why did it fail? Because we expected 1 to 1 to be 3, and actually it was 2. But then we could kind of reevaluate and say, okay, actually 1 plus 1 should in fact be 2. Last time I checked, and I run it again. And all is good. So that's how the Jest testing framework works. You can put as many tests as you want. So like I said, I've never been to Zurich, but I could sure write a test about it. So I could put test, the Zurich web community is nice, and I could put this as my test, and then expect, it has this autocomplete thing that is expect Zurich to be in Switzerland. I don't know if I spelled Switzerland right, but this is the part of the conversation where I say I'm actually American, so I could make silly mistakes like that, and it's okay. So then if I run it, npm test, and now it's going to also run my Zurich test, which also passes. But if I said that it is in France, then it should complain, and rightly so, because it is not, and as far as I know in terms of history, never has been. So there you go. So that's kind of how to do a basic test in Jest, but you're not here for that. You're here for testing GraphQL. That said, I just wanted to get that out of the way. So what I want to pitch to you about how to test GraphQL, there's 2 little bits in JavaScript land that you need to know in order to be able to do it, and both of them are pretty obfuscated. So this is kind of where, like, take notes. It's also open source, but just like write down that this is what to do. So the first thing is that you'll have some sort of schema, and you'll have some sort of resolvers if you're building with Apollo. And in your actual production code in GraphQL, you're going to write import from Apollo server, and then you're going to create an Apollo server here. However, you're going to create a different Apollo server for your test. So if you just import this, your test will explode and it will work. Instead, you're going to use a package. Sorry, I sound very declarative. You're going to, but just like I highly recommend you to use a package instead called Apollo Server Express. So here, I'm taking from Apollo Server Micro, and here I'm taking the same thing from Apollo Server Express. So otherwise, it's the same deal. I'm going to create an Apollo server with type depths and resolvers. Here I created it with the schema. If I click through has type depths and resolvers. So the basic setup is exactly the same. However, the library I import Apollo server from is different, and that makes all the difference. So if you import it from here, then it can be hooked up to Express, which is a Node.js REST API library. And by hooking it up to Express, and where I'm going to do that is server.apply middleware app, where app is Express. Then from there, I could use this package called Supertest. And this is the super mega important thing, is that Supertest is what's going to exercise or test very much like in the way that Guillaume was talking about. So let's scroll down to see how that works. So now I'm going to say request Supertest app. Remember, app up here is where we preloaded our GraphQL API. And I'm going to post to the GraphQL endpoint. I'm going to send the exact same mutation we saw before with password, with 0 like this. I'll set it to accept application.json. And then I'm going to expect that it's going to be 200, and I'm going to expect the GraphQL return to be true. So we'll run it again just to show that it's true and that all works. But now let's make it fail. And what I'm going to do is make it fail the exact same way that I made it fail in the UI. So if you remember, I had made it, instead of a 0, I had made an O. So theoretically, it should fail the same way. Otherwise, kind of we're in deep trouble. And in fact, it does. So it says cannot read property authenticate as root of null, which is exactly what we wanted, meaning that it doesn't even return that because we had an incorrect password. So now if we change it to the correct password, it should work just fine. So we got the bug doesn't look the same because it's provoking the CLI instead of a web UI, but nonetheless, the bug is exposed, which is what we wanted. So a couple other little weird bits of this, and this gets under the hood in GraphQL in ways that some people might not know, that GraphQL, all it is, and don't let anybody tell you otherwise, is a post request to an endpoint with 3 fields. Here, I only used one of them. The other 2 are optional, and it's called query. And inside your query, you put whatever you want. So in here, I put a mutation. I could also put like query me, for example, me, that's like the query that we saw before. But here I put that authentication mutation. So you can't, this is a mistake I see all the time, and it's a totally understandable one. I see people say, okay, I'm going to send my GraphQL like this. So I'll send a string. Because when you're sending GraphQL, it feels like you're sending a string, but actually you're not. Under the hood, all GraphQL libraries wrap the GraphQL string in a JSON object with query in front of it. That's just what the spec is for GraphQL. So that's a little bit of extra manual work you need to do, but like it's just creating a JavaScript object. And then the other bit that might seem a little bit weird is when you get a response back from GraphQL, it's JSON, so that much you know if you're working with GraphQL, but it's wrapped in this thing called data. So it will either have data or error. So data dot authenticate as root as opposed to just authenticate as root. So that's most GraphQL libraries kind of shave off the data part because it's like one extra layer, right? Like we need an object called data. You can just scroll down. But here, true, like we're expecting true, we got undefined because all it has in there is data and errors if there are errors, but there are none. So there you go. So in order to use programmatic tests from Jest, by the way, one thing I should say, just to point it out, is that this didn't run a long time at all. It's like as fast as the Jest test. So what we're doing is we're spinning up a mini version of the server in every test. So we usually think of booting up servers as like a super heavy thing. But now, if I write 2 tests, I'm going to boot up 2 servers on off, and it was that fast. Like it cannot read property authenticated root is null. So the data is null. So actually, we expect it to fail. So we're going to expect the data to be null because we have the wrong password, and now the test should run. So here, I'm booting up 2 servers, and it happened in 1.522 seconds. So basically, in your unit test, you can boot up like hundreds of GraphQL servers, and it'll take like a few seconds to run. So it's not it's a really lightweight thing, and all you have to do is remember these little syntax warts. Like you have to wrap it in query, you have to do one extra level deep called data, but then you could do all the expectations you want exactly as if you're writing with Cucumber or Jest or JUnit or whatever. So the way I'm trying to demystify GraphQL is all GraphQL is a post request to an API with a JSON object that says query. And if you test it just like you tested your own REST API, then you can use the same exact tools. You don't need anything fancy or above and beyond that. But as I said in the beginning of my presentation, a lot of times the tools kind of move us away, but because the tools simplify life, they move us away from the testability of the thing, and that is what I'm showing you now how to do. So as I mentioned, it's open source, it's online. I made a PR, so it's not merged into the Manchester branch yet. It's in this branch called Zurich for the time being, but it's in the Michigan Bank. So feel free to copy and paste the code, test your GraphQL APIs. And if you have any questions about how to do it, just please let me know. And that's all I got.